You can't park here, old man. This spot's for people who actually need it. Officer Kendrick's voice cut through the autumn air. Walt Graham, 79, stood silently beside his van, its front wheels already lifted. He held up his disabled veteran placard with trembling hands. I have my permit, he said softly, offering his VA ID. The officer didn't bother looking. Take it up with the city. No one helped. No one cared. Walt stepped back, sat on a cold bench, and watched as his only way home disappeared into traffic. Then, without warning, the street fell silent. 3 military SUVs rolled in like thunder. 6 Marines stepped out. And a retired general? He walked past the officer without a word and saluted the old man. That's when everyone realized. They hadn't just towed a van. They disrespected a living legend. Walt Graham didn't stand out in a crowd, not anymore. At 79, he moved slower than most, his gait stiff with age and pain. But under the surface of this quiet old man was a life forged in duty, sacrifice, and unspeakable resilience. Every morning in St. Paul, Minnesota, before the sun touched the rooftops, Walt was already awake. His apartment, modest, tucked above a corner bookstore, was a place frozen in time. The kitchen still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and lemon oil, and the calendar above the sink hadn't once missed a Marine Corps birthday. He didn't have much, but what he had, he cared for with the same discipline that had carried him through 30 years of service in the United States Marine Corps. His days started the same way they had for decades. Coffee, black, a little too weak. He'd chuckle at the memory of his late wife, Margaret, who used to tease him for it. Walt, if I can see the bottom of the cup, it's not coffee, it's a suggestion. Her photo still sat by the window, beside a faded American flag folded in a triangle. Before breakfast, Walt would open the window and hoist the flag just outside, always at the proper angle, always at the proper height. It wasn't about showmanship, it was about respect. Then, cane in hand, he'd walk the hallways of the building, checking in on the other tenants. He'd bring the paper to Mrs. Kowalski, a widow down the hall who had trouble with stairs, and often leave a candy bar on the doorknob of apartment 3B, where the Anderson kids lived. These were quiet routines. They gave him purpose. But outside that calm rhythm lay the weight of battles long past. Walt had served in Vietnam, Beirut, and even trained troops in Desert Storm. He rose to the rank of Sergeant Major, a title that didn't come easily and one he never used to introduce himself. He wore no medals on his jacket and didn't share stories unless asked directly. But if you looked closely, you'd see the signs. A slight tremor in his right hand, nerve damage from shrapnel still buried near his spine. The way he never quite relaxed in crowds. The 1,000-yard stare that sometimes visited him during rainstorms. His van, an aging blue Ford, dented but reliable, was more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of the one thing he prized most after Margaret passed: independence. Outfitted with a lift and hand controls, it took him everywhere. His VA appointments, the grocery store, the local park where he fed birds and read military history beneath the oaks. The van had seen better days, sure, but it was his. And for a man who'd spent years serving others, it was the only thing still serving him. In the glove compartment sat his credentials, his disabled parking tag, his VA ID, his laminated discharge papers, folded and refolded so often they felt like fabric. Some people collected souvenirs from their travels. Walt carried proof that he'd survived his. He didn't ask for handouts. He never would. But he did expect one thing: respect. Not the kind shouted across parades or posted on bumper stickers. The quiet kind. The kind that lets a man park his van without being questioned. The kind that sees a cane, a placard, and assumes dignity, not deceit. That morning, as Walt drove downtown for a specialist checkup, something he rarely did, he parked like always, cautious, double-checking the sign, the curb, the placard in the mirror. And for a few peaceful minutes, everything felt like it still made sense, but in just 5 words. You can't park here, old man. His world would be stripped down to pavement, pride, and the judgment of strangers. And no one yet knew the storm he'd already survived. Downtown was bustling by 9:15 a.m., a blur of briefcases, coffee cups, and car horns. Walt Graham had arrived early, just to be safe. The specialist clinic on the third floor of the medical building was new to him. Navigating unfamiliar terrain wasn't easy anymore. Not with his knees in rebellion and his cane clicking a slower rhythm than it used to, but he'd found a spot, a clearly marked blue-striped handicap space right across from the main entrance. Walt double-checked everything, his placard hanging clearly from the rearview mirror, his VA ID in his wallet, and his handicapped registration displayed on the dash. He had followed the rules to the letter. The moment he stepped out of his van, he felt it, the weight of someone's gaze. Across the lot, Officer Noah Kendrick leaned against his patrol cruiser, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He was young, 32 at most, with a buzz cut that could have passed for military if it weren't for the smugness in his posture. Kendrick didn't see a veteran that morning. He saw an old man in a beat-up van, and that was enough. Walt's cane hit the pavement with a soft tap. He had only taken a few steps toward the clinic entrance when Kendrick's voice rang out across the lot. "Hey, you can't park there." Walt turned slowly, brow furrowing. "Excuse me." "That spot's for disabled permit holders," Kendrick said, walking toward him, eyes darting to the placard hanging in the windshield. "Can you read the sign, sir?" Walt blinked. The question felt like a slap. "Yes," he said, voice even. "I can read just fine. That's my placard. I'm a disabled vet." Kendrick stopped 3 feet away and looked him over, as if evaluating a counterfeit bill. "You got ID for that?" Walt reached for his wallet with shaking fingers, not because he was nervous, because of the nerve damage, the kind no one ever sees unless they look close. "Of course, right here." But Kendrick had already turned to wave over a tow truck idling nearby. "We get a lot of fakes," he muttered. "People borrowing grandma's tags. Happens all the time." The tow truck groaned to life, creeping forward. Walt's voice remained calm. "That placard is mine. My name's Walter Graham. VA confirmed, state issued. Please, just look." Kendrick shook his head and cut him off. "You really expect me to believe that?" The question wasn't sincere. It was rhetorical, designed to humiliate. Kendrick wasn't asking for proof. He was making a point. And the point was, I decide who belongs here. The driver of the tow truck, a large, impassive man in oil-streaked overalls, got out and began to hook up the van. Walt took a step forward. "Sir," he said quietly, "please, that van is modified. It's how I get to my medical appointments." Kendrick was now scribbling in his notepad, tearing off a ticket with unnecessary force. "Take it up with the city," he said without even looking up. "It's already being towed." A small crowd had begun to form on the sidewalk. Shoppers, dog walkers, a man sipping coffee. They watched, curious, but no one stepped in. No one asked questions. No one questioned the uniform. Walt looked at them, hoping to find a kind face, someone to speak up. But they looked away. Embarrassed or inconvenienced, he couldn't tell. Either way, they stayed silent. He held out his VA card. Kendrick didn't take it. Walt's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. Didn't shout. He simply said, "I earned that permit in a place called Quezon. I buried friends who never made it home." Kendrick gave a dry, disbelieving chuckle. "Yeah? You sure they didn't bury you too?" That one hurt, more than Walt would admit. The tow truck driver finished latching the chain and gave Kendrick a nod. Walt's van, his lifeline, lurched forward, wheels off the ground, like it was being carried to judgment. Walt stood there motionless as his means of freedom, his link to the world, was taken from him by a stranger who hadn't bothered to ask a single honest question. The air was crisp, but Walt didn't feel the cold anymore. He only felt the silence. Not just the silence around him, but the silence of everyone who had seen it happen and said nothing. That silence said more than Kendrick's badge ever could. The tow truck's hydraulics hissed as the van's frame tilted higher, exposing the undercarriage to the city air. Walt's van, scratched, battle-worn, reliable, looked almost vulnerable up there, like an old soldier forced to stand trial. Officer Kendrick was still scribbling into his citation pad, expression smug, as if this moment confirmed all his assumptions. Improper use of a handicap placard, potential fraud, obstructing enforcement, he murmured, exaggerating each word with bureaucratic glee. Walt didn't interrupt him. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out something no one had expected. An old flip phone, the kind most people hadn't seen in a decade. It was scratched and scuffed, with tape holding the battery in place. He opened it with a practiced thumb and navigated a contact list with just a few names. VA clinic, pharmacy, Margaret, voicemail, and one labeled simply T. Harlan, emerge. The crowd hadn't dispersed. In fact, a few more had gathered. No one helped, but they watched, half out of curiosity, half because they sensed something unusual unfolding. Some assumed he was calling a cab. One younger man whispered, "Poor guy, probably calling for a ride." Another replied, "He should have just parked somewhere else. It's not worth all this." Walt ignored them all. He brought the phone to his ear, steady now, despite the cold and the sting of humiliation. The ring buzzed once, twice. Then, "Tom?" A pause. "Yes, it's Walt Graham." Another pause. "Yeah, I know. Been a while." He glanced over his shoulder at the van, now almost fully suspended. The chains clinked faintly in the crisp morning breeze. "I'm at 4th and Jefferson, downtown, city lot. Got into a bit of a situation." Another beat of silence. Walt nodded faintly as the voice on the other end spoke. "No rush. I just thought you should know." He clicked the phone shut with a gentle snap and slipped it back into his coat. That was it. No threats, no name dropping. Just a quiet call to an old friend. Then Walt turned, deliberately, slowly, and walked to the edge of the lot where a low stone bench sat in the shadow of a maple tree. His cane ticked a gentle rhythm across the pavement, tapping once for each step. He sat down without a grunt or a sigh. He didn't lean back. He didn't slouch. He sat upright, shoulders straight, like he was still at morning roll call. His back hurt, but he didn't show it. His knees ached, but he didn't complain. From across the street, Kendrick noticed the old man had moved but paid him no real mind. He just tore off the citation and prepared to leave it under the windshield that was no longer there. In the growing silence, the tow truck began to move again. The van was fully secured now, front tires lifted high as it rolled slowly toward the curb. The chain links rattled, a cruel soundtrack to Walt's quiet dignity. The bystanders remained silent. A few folded their arms. One woman turned away entirely, unable to watch. No one asked who he had called. No one cared. But Walt sat steady, his expression unreadable, his pride intact. Because even when you've been pushed aside, talked down to, and robbed of the one piece of freedom you have left, you don't lose who you are. Not if you've earned every scar, and not if the man on the other end of that call still answers. After all these years, 20 minutes passed. The city block had returned to its usual pace. Almost. Traffic hummed. The crowd had thinned, but not entirely. A few still lingered, pretending not to stare at the old man on the bench. Officer Kendrick was leaning against his cruiser now, one foot crossed over the other, scrolling his phone like nothing significant had happened. Walt Graham hadn't moved. He sat quietly, as if carved from stone, his cane resting across his knees, his eyes watching the road. Not anxiously, but with the stillness of someone who'd learned long ago that timing was everything. And then, the street began to change. It started as a low rumble, subtle at first. Not sirens, not tires screeching, no panic, no chaos. Just the deep, resonant growl of powerful engines approaching in tight formation. A few heads turned, then more. The sound grew louder and more deliberate. 3 dark green military SUVs turned the corner onto Jefferson Avenue in perfect unison. Not rushing but moving with unmistakable purpose. Their windows were tinted, their bodies spotless, with official Marine Corps insignias gleaming on the doors. They didn't stop for traffic, they didn't need to. Like a precision convoy, they rolled forward and slowed only when they reached the spot where Walt's van had once sat. One SUV pulled directly in front of Officer Kendrick's cruiser, effectively blocking it. Another pulled tight against the curb near the bench where Walt still sat. The third positioned itself slightly behind the other two, forming a perimeter. The engines cut, doors opened in sync, and 6 active-duty Marines stepped out. Tall, square-shouldered, dressed in full Marine Corps dress blues with white gloves and medals displayed across their chests. Their shoes struck the pavement with an echo, sharp and deliberate, as they moved to formation without a single wasted motion. Every conversation on the street stopped. Even the birds seemed to hush. Then from the lead SUV, the passenger door opened, and out stepped a man whose presence shifted the air like weather. General Thomas Harlan, USMC, retired. His uniform was immaculate, tailored to perfection. Silver eagles glinted on his shoulders. His posture, even in retirement, was rigid with authority earned through decades of command. His face, deeply lined, gave no expression until his eyes fell on Walt. That's when it changed. Just for a moment. The steel melted slightly into something more human, a subtle, almost imperceptible softening. Recognition, respect. He didn't speak to the crowd. He didn't even glance at Officer Kendrick. He walked directly, purposefully, toward the bench where Walt sat, the 6 Marines flanking him in a loose perimeter that both protected and honored the space. Walt looked up, and something flickered in his tired eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or maybe just a weary kind of gratitude. But he didn't stand. He didn't have to. Because General Harlan stopped in front of him, and without a word, he snapped into a crisp, formal salute. The crowd audibly gasped. Kendrick stood frozen, halfway through unlocking his cruiser. His phone slipped slightly in his hand, forgotten. His earlier confidence drained from his face like color from a photograph. Harlan held the salute for a beat longer than necessary. Then he spoke, loud enough for every bystander to hear. "Sergeant Major Walter Graham, it is an honor." Walt gave the smallest of nods, his voice a low murmur. "Tom, you didn't have to come. You called," the general replied plainly. That was enough. The street, just moments ago indifferent and indifferent, felt like hallowed ground now. Strangers removed their hats. A delivery man stepped back onto the sidewalk, clutching his cap to his chest. A woman wiped her eyes. The shift in energy was visceral. No one saw an old man anymore. They saw a soldier, a leader, a man who had given more than most would ever understand. Then the general turned. His expression hardened as he faced Kendrick, who now stood stiff and pale, like a child caught in the middle of a funeral procession. "Officer," Harlan said, voice cold and commanding, "you didn't just tow a van. You disrespected one of the finest men we ever had in the Corps." Kendrick's mouth opened. No words came. The general took another step forward, closing the distance. "You looked at him and saw weakness. You saw inconvenience. But what you failed to see was valor, service, pain, sacrifice. You failed to see a legend." Every word landed like a thunderclap. The 6 Marines stood at attention behind him, still, stoic, unmoved. Officer Kendrick swallowed. Once, twice. But he didn't speak. He couldn't. Because how do you apologize when the entire block knows you're standing on the wrong side of history, and the man you humiliated didn't even have to raise his voice to prove it? Officer Kendrick stood like a statue, his uniform suddenly feeling far too small beneath the weight of 100 eyes. The badge that once gave him confidence now seemed like a spotlight, illuminating every crack in his character. General Thomas Harlan stepped forward once more, eyes locked onto Kendrick's with an intensity that could have melted steel. "You didn't just tow a van," he said, his voice cutting clean through the silence. "You disrespected a living legend." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. The young officer opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Only the faint squeak of leather as he adjusted his utility belt, trying to look composed. The general didn't wait for excuses. "Do you even know who this man is?" he asked, raising a single gloved finger and pointing directly at Walt Graham, still seated, still silent on the stone bench. "This is Sergeant Major Walter Graham, United States Marine Corps, retired. 30 years of service, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. He served in Khe during one of the bloodiest sieges in American history, and again in Fallujah, where he trained the next generation of Marines in urban warfare. His name is still spoken with reverence in units across the country." A hush fell over the street. Walt said nothing. He didn't need to. The medals spoke for themselves. Awards he never wore, stories he never told unless asked. He had never once introduced himself with his rank. And yet, now that the truth was out, it changed everything. That placard you thought was fake, Harlan continued, his voice rising slightly, issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs due to permanent spinal trauma. Shrapnel still lodged near his vertebrae. The man can't walk 50 feet without pain. That van you towed? It's equipped with a custom hydraulic lift for his mobility chair, hand controls, and adaptive driving tech, because he refuses to give up what little independence he has left. Officer Kendrick's face drained of all color. He took an involuntary step back, eyes darting from the general to the Marines standing in a half circle behind him. They stood unmoving, living symbols of discipline and judgment. One of them raised a small radio to his mouth and spoke quietly. General Harlan didn't look away. "Do you understand what you did today?" he said, slower now. "You didn't just enforce a rule. You insulted a man who spent his life defending the very freedoms that allow you to wear that badge." The crowd was silent, but their expressions told a story. Shame, respect, realization. People had come to watch a small drama, an old man, a parking violation. What they had witnessed was a history lesson in humility. Just then, the tow truck returned, escorted by a second police cruiser and two of the Marines. The driver, who just an hour ago hadn't met Walt's eyes, now stepped out of the cab with his cap in hand, visibly shaken. He approached carefully, head down. I'm sorry, sir," he muttered. "Didn't know." Walt just gave him a quiet nod. The Marines began unhooking the van with care, lowering it gently until its tires once again met the pavement. One of them walked around the vehicle, checking for damage. Another opened the driver's side door and adjusted the lift controls to ensure they were still functioning. It was no longer a van. It was a symbol of what should have never been questioned. As the van settled back into place, a new vehicle arrived. A sleek, unmarked car with flashing lights tucked discreetly behind the grille. From it stepped a man in a white shirt and black tie, Captain Ryan Morse, Kendrick's direct supervisor. He took one look at the scene. The Marines, the general, the watching crowd, the frozen officer, and his jaw tensed. He marched straight to Kendrick, leaned close, and spoke in a voice just loud enough to carry. "What the hell did you do?" Kendrick stammered. I thought the placard. He looked like what?" the captain snapped. "Like someone who didn't deserve it?" He turned to Harlan and extended his hand. "General Harlan, Captain Morse, I am deeply sorry for what has occurred today. This is not how we treat our veterans, especially not one with a service record like Sergeant Major Graham's." Harlan gave a tight nod but said nothing. He didn't need to. Captain Morse turned back to Kendrick. "You're relieved, effective immediately. Administrative leave, pending review." The crowd murmured again, but this time not in judgment, in approval. Kendrick stepped back, dazed, as another officer approached to take over his post. The badge had become heavier than he could bear. Walt watched from the bench, still quiet, still dignified. He hadn't asked for revenge. He hadn't asked for recognition. But what he received that day wasn't either of those. It was restoration, not just of his van, but of his place in the world. Officer Kendrick stood a few paces from Walt now, his clipboard hanging limp at his side, the half-written citation forgotten. His eyes, once sharp with authority, were glassy, uncertain. The color had drained from his face. The confident patrolman who barked at an old man was gone, replaced by someone smaller, quieter, as if realizing too late the weight of what he'd done. He took one tentative step forward. "Sir," he began, voice tight. "Mr. Graham, I didn't know. I wasn't trying to—" Walt held up a hand, not with anger, not to accuse, just enough to pause the moment. Their eyes met, one man in his 70s who had endured war, loss, and the long silence of post-service life, and another in his 30s who just learned how little he truly understood about duty. Walt didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult or blame. He simply said, "Now you know." It was not a condemnation. It was a truth. One Kendrick would carry with him for the rest of his career, if he had one left. And somehow those 3 words cut deeper than any lecture ever could. Kendrick gave a stiff nod, unable to look him in the eye. Then Captain Morse placed a firm hand on his shoulder and motioned him away. Another officer quietly took his place and began speaking with the Marines. Kendrick turned once more before being led off. hesitating as if to say something else. But the words never came. Walt didn't look back. The tow truck had long since pulled away. The street was still, not empty but respectful. A crowd that once watched in passive judgment now stood hushed, heads slightly bowed, expressions soft with remorse. The 6 Marines, still in their formation, adjusted as Walt stood up slowly from the bench. He moved carefully. Years of pain mapped across his body, but he stood tall, unshaken in spirit. General Harlan approached and gently opened the driver's door of the restored van. "We checked it over, Walt. Everything's intact." Walt gave a quiet nod. "Appreciate that, Tom." He gripped the door handle, glanced at the crowd, then eased himself into the driver's seat with the slow dignity of a man climbing into more than a vehicle. He was stepping back into the life they tried to strip from him. The engine turned over with a comforting rumble. Familiar, dependable, just like the man behind the wheel. As the van prepared to pull away, General Harlan stepped back, came to attention, and offered another crisp, formal salute. The 6 Marines did the same, in perfect silence. Walt met their eyes through the windshield. No words were exchanged, none were needed. Just a slow, almost imperceptible nod from the old sergeant major to the young Marines standing tall in the morning light. The street, for a moment, felt like a parade ground. No fanfare, no banners, just respect. Real, earned, overdue. The crowd, strangers, workers, passers-by, stood completely still as the van eased forward, merging into the flow of city traffic like any other vehicle. But to those who watched it leave, it wasn't just a van. It was a symbol of quiet heroism, of battles fought and battles endured, of dignity that refused to be broken. And as Walt Graham disappeared down the avenue, every pair of eyes remained on him, not in pity, but in awe. They had witnessed something rare, not a man being honored, but a man reminding the world that he always was. It wasn't about revenge, it never was. Walt Graham didn't call General Harlan to prove a point or to make a spectacle out of a young officer's ignorance. He didn't sit silently on that bench to make people feel guilty. He didn't demand an apology, raise his voice, or ask for a crowd. He simply stood his ground. With the quiet dignity of a man who'd spent his life defending freedoms most people never think twice about. Because for Walt, and for thousands of veterans like him, it was never about power, it was always about respect. And sometimes, that's the one thing they're denied the most. In the days that followed, the story of what happened on Jefferson Avenue spread far beyond the neighborhood. A few bystanders had recorded pieces of it on their phones. Clips went viral, of Marines saluting an old man, of the general's powerful words, of Walt's simple statement, "Now you know." But even without the videos, the moment etched itself into the community's memory. It became something people talked about over coffee, in classrooms, at the dinner table. Parents told their kids about it. Teachers used it as a lesson on character. And every morning after that, the children who passed Walt's apartment on their way to school would wave to him as he lowered the flag from his window. Some even started calling him Colonel Walt, though he always chuckled and corrected them. "Sergeant Major, thank you very much." The police department issued a formal apology days later, public, sincere, and long overdue. Officer Kendrick was placed on extended leave, and internal protocols were rewritten from the ground up. Sensitivity training wasn't just implemented, it became mandatory. Every cadet from that point forward would hear the story of Walt Graham before they ever wore a badge. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about never letting anyone forget what respect looks like. As for Walt, he never spoke publicly about that morning. He didn't grant interviews or sit for photo ops. He simply resumed his quiet routines, feeding birds, visiting the VA, fixing broken things around the building, and waving back to the kids who saluted him in the hallway. But something had changed. People saw him now, not because he asked to be seen, but because he had shown them something they didn't know they needed to learn. Real heroes don't shout, but when they speak, when they choose to be heard, the world listens. And that, perhaps, is the lesson we carry forward. That honor isn't something you wear on your sleeve. It's something you live. And sometimes all it takes is one quiet man to remind an entire city what it means. In a world where noise often drowns out wisdom, where appearances overshadow experience, The story of Walter Graham reminds us of a truth we too often forget. Not all heroes raise their voices. Some simply endure. What happened on that sidewalk wasn't just a clash between authority and misunderstanding. It was a mirror held up to our society, a society that sometimes forgets to slow down, to listen, to see. Walt didn't lash out. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't try to prove himself through shouting or shame. He just made one quiet call and let a lifetime of honor speak for itself. And maybe that's the lesson we need right now. In our communities, workplaces, and even families, how many times have we rushed to judgment? How many times have we failed to recognize the quiet strength of someone who's lived through more than we can imagine? In today's fast-paced culture, respect has to be intentional, especially for those who paved the way before us, veterans, elders, neighbors who've seen the best and worst of this country and still believe in its promise. So let's reflect together. Have you ever witnessed someone being quietly disrespected, only to later realize who they truly were? How do we teach younger generations the difference between power and wisdom, between noise and dignity? Should basic veteran recognition be part of our public service training in every department, from law enforcement to customer service? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else to look a little closer, to listen a little better. And if this story meant something to you, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that celebrate respect, resilience, and remembrance. We bring these tales to light not just to honor the past, but to guide how we treat each other moving forward. To all our elders, veterans, and quiet heroes out there, thank you. We see you, and we won't forget. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and stay listening.